We're starting off with writing ethnographic field notes by Emerson, Fretz, and Shaw. We're just reading a couple of chapters from it and specifically thinking about the sort of the nuts and bolts of field notes. Now, from the opening sentence, the authors make three important points. First of all, ethnographers write. This is sort of given in the words. So ethnographer, grapher having to do with writing, it's given in the name. But their point is that this is the kind of work that we do. We wind up writing. But what we write about comes from field work, from what we can glean from the field when we're out actually doing first-person field work. But finally, different ethnographers transform their field experience, so what they encounter in the first person when they're in the field, they transform that into writing in different ways, so that there's not one single template that will work for everybody, but rather you need to some extent, create your own approach as you go. So they point out then that ethnography typically involves lengthy, direct participation in the everyday life of the people about whom the ethnographer will later write, and that demands careful consideration to how to accomplish this intermediate stage between being in the field and producing let's say a publishable piece of work, this intermediary stage being note-taking. At play in the process of note-taking is this balance between what to write down as it happens and what to commit to memory. Because you can imagine if something is unfolding in front of you and you're busy taking down notes on it, then first of all, you're not any longer paying attention directly to what's happening in front of you. You're trying to just get it down as it happens on the page, so you're going to miss things. But also, beyond that, you're going to be, in many cases, actually directly participating in the event. So your opportunity to take notes might be quite limited. And if that's the case, then you need to rely on memory and writing up your notes later in the day. So then you need to balance these things. And it's going to be a little bit different in your circumstances than for the typical ethnographer, in that I'm not asking you for this project to go to some far off land, learn the language, integrate yourself among people who live there, and to some extent, and then start documenting whatever aspect of their lives it is that is the subject of your study. You're doing it in your home country, possibly your home island if you live on Staten Island and you research in Staten Island. And so the setup is slightly different. All that said, many of the same sorts of obstacles that they're writing about will also confront you, like this thing of when to just pay attention to what is going on in front of you and what people are saying, and when to take a moment to get a note down. These are things that become easier with experience, but of course, part of what this course is about is developing that experience. So then there will be some circumstances in which it's really important to get down word for word what somebody has said. You might even need to ask them to repeat it so that you can get the phrasing exactly right, because sometimes getting things down verbatim, word for word, is crucial. At other times, you might want to take just a couple quick notes about what's happening in the background. And so your sort of point of focus will alter, and the nature of the notes that you take in either case will be different as well. So, participating in order to write, first section. In this section, they start with a problem of what to write down. What's noteworthy? What do I need to jot down? And what can I just trust to my memory? This is not a set of questions that has easy answers, but they do have some suggestions how to work out what it is that you really need to concentrate on getting down in a note, something to spur your memory later, and something that you can just commit to memory in the moment and then write down your summary of it later on. First, they say, as an ethnographer, as somebody in the field, a researcher, take note of your initial impressions. What is it that strikes you about the situation right off the bat? So this can include anything: smells, sounds, the impressions you get of the physical location, of the people who are there, how they're relating to one another, possibly even tastes, when tastes are a factor. So as much as anything, these are going to give you a starting point, even if, say, down the road, tastes wind up being unimportant for your analysis. A very quick example from my own field work. I did research in Thailand, and this was in this moment that I'm thinking of was in early 2005. So after the tsunami that hit Indonesia, Sri Lanka, Thailand, and other places. I had accompanied a group of lawyers to southern Thailand. They were down there to work with Burmese migrants who had been affected by the tsunami and who, for a number of reasons not important for this story, were very vulnerable to human rights abuses. And so these human rights lawyers were down there to work with them. And at one breakfast, I joined the team of lawyers and ordered an egg from the vendor who was there, and I put some salt on it, as was my habit. And one of the lawyers got sort of a funny expression on his face, and as I bit into the egg, it was incredibly salty, and I couldn't do it. And then he said, "Yeah, I was wondering why you put salt on it, because it's baked in salt. It's already a salty egg." And I didn't know this. I had just ordered something quickly. And so now that is a little anecdote where taste comes into it. It revealed something about the situation, my lack of familiarity with this particular cooking technique for eggs. But it didn't ultimately make it into my ethnography. I couldn't see a way that it came to bear on the questions I was trying to investigate. But you could also see then how something like taste that's an impression. That's something to take note of. It had some kind of role in the interaction that we had. It created a certain kind of moment that I could write about if I had been writing about something else. So all of these different things then, all of these initial impressions, these are what the authors want you to pay attention to as a first step. Second, researchers can focus on what is significant or unexpected. So anything that strikes you as unanticipated, as jarring, as therefore noteworthy, jot a note about it. Third, and following from this, they write, field researchers should move beyond their personal reactions to attend explicitly to what those in the setting experience and react to as significant or important. Now, this is a crucial move. So you're moving from your initial impressions to taking note of what matters to the people you're trying to understand and write about. That's ultimately where you want to get. This is a transition that can take some time if you're working in a place that is not familiar to you. I think it will not be so difficult in your case. You'll have different challenges than that. So then this is the kind of thing, though, that will become visible to the researcher over time, who pays attention to what the people in the area pay attention to. So this is going to be something, I think, important just to keep in your mind as you're doing interviews, continuously asking yourself, so what is it that matters to the people I'm talking about or talking to? How can I tune in to the things that are of issue for them? Because ultimately, this is not an exercise in writing about yourselves. This is an exercise in gaining an understanding and writing about other people. And then, okay, final point about this then. Even though you might not initially have a clear sense of why it matters, this thing that's important to the people you're interviewing, it's worthwhile jotting things down, even that don't quite make sense to you, that haven't quite gelled for you yet. Their importance might become clearer down the road. And so if you have that note, then you can come back and say, oh yeah, okay, this is what was going on, and now I see how it connects up to these other things that are important. If you don't take the note down, it is much more likely that it will just slip from your memory entirely, and you won't be able to reconstruct that connection later on. Now, to get a sense of the importance of local events and people's reaction to them, what people say about them, and so on, the researcher, they write, discerns local meanings not so much by directly asking actors about what matters to them, but more indirectly and inferentially by looking for perspectives and concerns embedded and expressed in naturally occurring interaction. So, in other words, they're saying, just watch their natural interaction when you can. Try not to intervene to disrupt that, but allow it to unfold, because very often getting at what matters to somebody is going to be something that is an implicit part of their lives, that if you ask about it explicitly, will produce maybe some puzzlement, maybe some very strange answers, and will not be as clearly revealed as if you just watch what they do and listen for what they say in this sort of course of everyday interaction. Okay, carrying on. They say, and in gleaning indigenous meanings implicit in interaction, the ethnographer is well placed to apprehend these meanings not simply as static categories, but rather as matters involving action and process. So action and process, these are important things to tune into. This requires not just that the ethnographer describes interactions, but that she consistently attend to when, where, and according to whom in shaping all field note descriptions. Now, fourth, systematically noting how routine actions are organized and take place can allow the ethnographer to become oriented in a new setting. This is something that is probably not going to be as instrumental to your own research because there's a way that you're just doing a few interviews. So you're getting maybe 5 or 6 hours with the people that you're interviewing. You're not going through the course of everyday life with them, noting when people wake up, what they do when they get up, when they eat, whether they eat together or individually, and so on. All of those things are going to sort of fall out of the scope of what you can do, just because of the nature of the research that you're doing. What is important from this, though, is this idea of placing an emphasis on how questions, how things happen, rather than why. So how questions direct your attention to what they call, or what they say is, social and interactional processes through which members construct, maintain, and alter their social worlds. If you just ask why questions, why does somebody do this, you're kind of restricting yourself to almost sort of pop psychological answers to the questions you're pursuing. If you ask rather how things happen, then you're going to be much more tuned into these things of process, of interaction, and so forth. Fifth, while researchers should initially cast a wide net and write about a variety of interactions and incidents, they should take these interactions and events as having some bearing on what she or he will observe and describe in the future. So then you take note of things that are happening now. In the future, you take note of something that is similar, and you're able to make that connection about similarity or the specific differences between things that are largely similar but not identical on the strength of having that observation that you got in the first instance. This is how things like patterns emerge. This is how you catch on to the way that specific figures of speech, for example, arise in people's talk when you're interviewing them. And then you're able to come back to those figures of speech when they reappear later and say, oh yeah, I remember this other person, or maybe the same person at an earlier date, put this in almost exactly the same terms. So there's something going on here that is noteworthy. Okay, so jottings. This is the bread and butter of what you're going to be doing actually in the field during your interviews. So a jotting is just a brief note, a brief written record of events and impressions captured in keywords and phrases. These don't even need to be full sentences, right? You're just trying to get things down to give yourself some purchase on the moment later on. When you come back to this, you'll have given yourself enough to recall a scene fairly clearly, be able to fill in the details that are not in your jottings so that you can reproduce the parts of that moment that were important and relevant for your study. So they're memory cues as much as anything. And you use them as spurs to your memory for when you write up longer notes later on. So they can include verbatim quotations of speech. As I said, when that speech is important, it's an important passage to get exactly right, then you're going to want to write down the whole thing. But otherwise, you're just trying to get down something quick to anchor your memory in that moment. You can fill in the broader context later. Now, if it's possible, adopt a shorthand code. So I've given an example here. This is not a comprehensive code. It's just a quick example where you can use shorthand symbols to dramatically speed up your note taking, right? Because now you don't need to write down full words when you can just write down a little squiggle that's going to be meaningful for you when you come back to it later. They say, as preludes to full written notes, so those are the notes that you would write down when you get back home or wherever it is that you write out your longer notes. To full written notes, jottings capture bits of talk and action from which the field worker can begin to sketch social scenes, recurring incidents, local expressions and terms, members' distinctions and accounts, dialogue among those present, and his own conversations. So learning to write about and how much you need to jot to spur your memory is you get a feel for it over time. It's like any other skill. You don't just have it when you start out. It will take a little bit of time to get a handle on it. To this end, you might want to do something to practice. I mean, you're all students, and so you have some practice in taking down notes in class. So what you could do, for example, is go through a section of this or one of the other lectures and don't read any of the slides. Just listen to what I'm saying and try and figure out how you can take quick notes that will allow you to get the gist of what I'm saying without actually being able to rely on writing down full sentences. Figure out what it is that you need to act as a spur to your memory later on so that you could then transform it into longer notes, and what it is that you can kind of let slip by because those are gaps that you can fill in on your own. I mean, this is something, as I say, you can do this as you watch the future lectures. I wouldn't recommend doing it for all of any one of the lectures. You're just trying to practice. So just pick a section of 10 or 15 minutes, give it a try, see what works for you, see what doesn't, and then try it again later on. Try to refine your techniques so that by the time you go to do your interviews, you've already started to develop a sense of how it is that you want to approach taking notes with people who are not going to be on a video like this, so that you can't go and rewatch it again. You're going to have to get it that time. You only get one take, as it were. Okay, some things you can try from the outset. First, they say, jot down details of what you sense are key components of observed scenes, events, or interactions. Whatever seems most important to you, get those details down. Ultimately, that's what you're going to have to rely on. You're trying to tune into what's important to the people you're interviewing, but you do that by, first of all, trying to get a handle yourself on what seems important. What seems important to them is just another way of directing your attention to generally what seems important. So start there. Second, jot down concrete sensory details about observed scenes and interactions. This is important because concrete details are what give a study its specificity, what sort of breathes life into a study and keeps it from just being this kind of generic thing filled with stereotypes and cliches. Concrete details are extremely valuable for this. Those can be all sorts of different things. They can be, as I was saying on a couple of occasions already, getting down exactly what it is that people say. It can be things about the environment in which the people you're interviewing are when you interview them. It can be any kind of these sensory details, as they say. Whatever it is that you pick up on that strikes you as important, but is concrete in nature. Specificity. Specificity is the call sign of ethnography. Third, branching from that, avoid generalizations and summaries of scenes. Those lend themselves to these sort of generic glosses that could be written about anything or any people. They lack specificity, they lack particularity, and so they're not helpful in getting at what is distinctive about these people you're interviewing or these people you're interacting with and what they're saying. Fourth, jottings capture detailed aspects of a scene, and direct quotes are especially helpful in capturing detail, right? So again, ideas of concreteness, getting verbatim accounts where it's important, being specific and concrete. All of these things are about paying attention to detail. Stress things that show rather than tell people's behavior. So then what is it that is revealing in somebody's behavior? People can say all kinds of things about themselves, but what matters is what they actually do. These kinds of jottings then can also help recapture the specific sequence of talk, of how action unfolds, and things like this. So detail, again, is what will give your ethnography its life, its vitality, what will make it distinctive. Fifth, jottings can record details of emotional expression and experience to orient the researcher to understand how others understand and evaluate what was going on. It makes sense, right? That if you are able to note down other people's reactions, other people's responses, other people's expression when they're talking about the particular things you're talking about, that is your point of access to what matters to them, right? This is a way of tracking what is vital for the people you're interviewing, who you want to understand. So jot those things down. Pay attention to people's emotional expression, their affect. Sixth, use jottings to signal your general impressions and feelings, even if you're unsure of the significance in the moment. This comes back to what I was saying earlier, that what is important about this particular moment might not become clear until later on. Something that seems sort of incidental, something that just seems to be passing, might wind up being quite important later. And so you want to jot as much as you can down so that your memory has these kinds of hooks into reality, that it can go back and recall what it was that you had noticed at that time, even though you weren't necessarily sure of why it was important, or even if it was important. Now, okay, so finally, approach a setting as full of potential jottings, so that you're trying, when you enter the setting, to tune in to what you could possibly write a quick note about. This will start to alert you, hopefully, to what is significant or potentially significant within the scene of your research. Okay, so the how, where, and when of jottings. The authors explore how jotting notes it's a social exercise. You're doing it in the presence of others. You're doing it with respect to what they say and what they do, and how you interact and how they interact with one another. So it's always going to be social in nature. It's going to happen in a social environment. In short, then, bringing out a pen and paper can alter the social environment in which the researcher takes down jottings, and it's worth some thought on what it is that you want to use. Do you want to have a larger notebook? Well, to put into the foreground the fact that, yeah, you're taking notes on what people are saying to you. Do you want to use something that's more discreet, easy to carry around, perhaps? On the whole, I think the less intrusive, the better. The more intrusive your recording tools are, the more it's going to be disruptive to, so to speak, the everydayness of the interactions that you get between the people you're talking to, and between them and between you and them. This is part of the reason I don't want you to use voice recorders. People very often, when they know that they're being recorded, it alters how they speak, it alters what they say. It can make them feel far less comfortable. It can make them speak in sort of vague generalities because they're suddenly ill at ease, saying things more candidly as they might just in the course of an ordinary conversation. And so that's one reason. Also, it's just it's a very, very valuable skill to learn how to take notes as people are speaking, and it saves a step. If you take down voice recordings, you just have to transcribe them later, and that is a chore. So instead, use a notepad or a booklet or whatever it is that you find works for you, and a pen. Remember that you might be in a circumstance, depending on what happens in the next couple months with the pandemic, you might be in a circumstance where you're in people's presence, but you might be outdoors, for example. And so you might not have a surface on which to write. So you might find that you actually need something that you can just hold in your hand and write on, because that's all you're going to be able to do. So enough about that. Just try and keep these things in mind. As I say, I think on the whole, the less intrusive the material that you use for taking down what people say, the more candid and forthcoming they tend to be in what they say. So ultimately, the researcher has to remain attentive to the circumstances in which he or she is jotting notes. You have to read the situation to work out whether the way that you're taking down these notes is getting in the way of the research or not. Is it getting in the way of you connecting with the people you want to understand and write about, or is it not causing any problem at all? So for me, for example, one thing that I had to learn to become comfortable with was silence. So sometimes when I was noting something down, when I was speaking with somebody, this happened especially when I was interviewing people during my research, I sometimes had to catch up with what they were saying. And so I had to become comfortable with allowing there to be some silence while I caught up. That was not a very comfortable situation to be in. I didn't like it. I wanted the person to feel like I was engaged, and so I wanted to respond verbally. But sometimes it was just more important to get down what they were talking about. And so I had to become at ease with that. The added benefit of that is very often in any sort of social circumstance, people really don't like silence. And so if you leave silence, very often people will fill it. They'll start talking again on their own initiative, and you could get some very interesting things that way. So sometimes a little bit of discomfort around things like just being silent as you catch up with your notes can actually become, oddly enough, enabling for the conversation. So these are things I think you need to assess as you go, figure out what it is that is going to set the people you're talking with at ease to speak freely, and what sorts of things are just going to get in the way and keep them from being forthright, being forthcoming. So, all right, reflections, writing, and ethnographic marginality. The authors point in this section to this constant tension between remaining analytically distant so that you're able to analyze what's going on by taking that certain sort of critical distance from what's happening, and trying to become involved or intimate enough to get what is going on and to merit the trust of the people you're trying to understand and with whom you're doing your research. So this is a tricky thing. It's trickier when you're trying to work your way into an unfamiliar setting. So I am not Thai. I don't think that's a big revelation. And so when I was in Thailand, I had to spend a fair bit of time doing the things necessary that I could interact with them socially fairly fluidly, fairly comfortably. So I had to learn forms of politeness so that I could express politeness to the people who I was interacting with. I had to learn the language, of course. There were all of these, and I had to participate in the lawyers who I was talking about before who went to southern Thailand, I had to participate in what they were doing so that I could get a handle on what it was that was going on. all of these things sort of militate against maintaining that critical analytical distance to watch as if from the outside. So watching from the outside has the merit of sort of giving you the scope of what's going on, but it leaves you on the outside. It means that you're not participating directly, and therefore developing that intimacy with your circumstances and surroundings to get the subtleties of what's happening. So these things are in tension. They're not necessarily opposed to each other, but they're in tension with one another. And it's a balancing act that you need to work your way through in these kinds of settings. I think that it's not going to be quite as taxing for you because you'll be doing your work in a familiar setting, so that gaining that kind of, I don't like this word very much, but that this sort of insiderism is not something that you need to work on in the same way that you would if you were going to a place unfamiliar to you. The flip side, though, is that too much familiarity, and this is, I think, the risk that you'll face, can give you this kind of fish in water problem, that your social medium becomes transparent to you. So transparency is very nice if you want to gain a relatively unobstructed understanding of what's going on. For example, not having to translate from another language into your own language what people are saying around you, but just knowing the language to begin with. But troublesome in terms of having too habitual a relationship, so that the things that your interviewees are taking for granted, but are nonetheless very, very interesting from an analytical point of view, those things it will be easy for you to take for granted as well, and just for them to sort of slip underneath your radar, not recognizing possibly that these are really notable things, really interesting things. So this is sort of the trade-off that you're going to confront. They write, writing field notes creates and underlies this socially close but experientially separate stance. The ethnographer's field note writing practices, please ignore that I have not capitalized the T at the beginning of that sentence, writing jottings on what others are doing in their presence, observing in order to write, writing extended field notes outside the immediacy of the field setting, specifically create and sustain separation, marginality, and distance in the midst of personal and social proximity. So then you may not face social marginality in the sense of being recognizably an outsider, but for the most part, we don't bring pen and paper into our social environments and take note of what the people around us are doing and saying. You can imagine if you were to go out to for drinks with friends and you start noting what everybody says, that is going to create a weird situation. People might not be so comfortable with you doing that. They're going to have some questions for you, probably, about what's going on. So that process of pulling out your booklet and taking notes, that will have some of this kind of marginalizing effect that they're talking about here. And so it will position you in a certain respect vis-a-vis the people you're interviewing, the people you're trying to understand. Chapter 3, writing field notes. At desk, creating scenes on a page. You've taken down your jottings from your field experience, from your interviews. Now you've left that setting. You're going to wherever it is that you write up your notes for the day. Maybe that's at home. Maybe it's at the library. Maybe it's in the park. I don't know. Doesn't matter. You're now in that place where you're typing up your notes. So in your case, interviews. Making that transition is not this kind of transparent, simple process of producing a faithful report. You construct an account. You do this partly from your notes and partly from your memory. And of course, they're these two things are constrained by your perceptions. You can only work with what you've perceived after all. And you're making choices along the way of how to present this account, how to constitute this account. So then the account itself is your creation, your construction of what you experienced and what you jotted down in the process of doing your interviews. Whether it be an incident, event, routine, interaction, or visual image, ethnographers recreate each moment from selected details and sequences that they remember or have jotted down. Words, gestures, body movements, sounds, background setting, and so on. While writing, they further highlight certain actions and statements more than others in order to portray their sense of an experience. In other words, ethnographers create scenes on a page through highly selective and partial recountings of observed and re-evoked details. Right? So then the idea that you can comprehensively reproduce a scene is simply out. It's simply out. You're not going to be able to do that. It's not within our capacities to do that. So then what we do is we construct or reconstruct what we have perceived to have happened. The author's first piece of advice is to write notes as soon as possible after your field work is done. So in your case, you've done your interview. Maybe you found that you need to do the interview by Zoom. So you're already maybe in front of your desk. You've just finished your Zoom interview. That's the ideal moment to write it up. It's fresh in your mind. You've got all of your notes there from the meeting, so you can get there the meanings of your jottings. You can get the importance of your jottings most readily if you write them up right away. This is the ideal. Might not be possible though. It might be that you have to wait until later in the day. So the passage of time, of course, is going to somewhat diminish the immediacy of that experience that you've had and of your recollection of them. So then generating notes at the end of the day, if that's, this would be sort of the stereotypical thing for an ethnographer doing work in an unfamiliar setting. You've gone and you've done your research in the field during the day. You get back to your dwelling, say whatever that might be at the end of the day, and then you start writing up your notes. So there you're not trying to produce this polished piece of writing. Trying to get it too polished, put it too nicely, can get in the way of just getting it down on the page. That's your task with these notes, just getting it down on the page. You want an adequately complete account based on your jottings and your memory. You don't want to have the expectation that you're going to have something that is polished and beautifully written. Trying to write it beautifully is going to impede your recollection because you're going to be thinking more about how to put it than just the sort of functional aspect of just getting your notes down on the page. Polishing is for later. That's for when you're writing your paper. For this, you just want this intermediary stage between the jottings and your memory of your experiences in the field and the polished writing that will come later. You just want this intermediary stage where you get as complete and comprehensive an account as you can. You're giving yourself the material that you'll polish later, in other words. There are different strategies for recalling what happens during fieldwork. So one is to start with your own activities, your own placement in physical and social space, your movement, and so forth. So if you go back through your own day, think about where you were, who you were talking to, what it was that you were doing. That can be kind of the launching pad then for starting to incorporate what other people were doing around you, what other people were saying, what their movements were, and so on. Second is to begin with an important event or moment, something that remains vivid, and describe that as thoroughly as possible and work outward from there. So, to take an example from my own fieldwork, one of the major things that these lawyers were doing, the lawyers I was talking about, is they were setting up a DNA testing facility for Burmese migrants. So with that, I could describe the setting, I could describe who was there, the sorts of numbers of people who were coming to get tested, and who had organized it, whether there were Thai officials present or not, what the relationship was between the organizers of the testing facility itself, who happened to be ex-Burmese, naturalized American citizen who used to be Burmese, is central to this. How he related then to the lawyers. And so as I describe that scene, then I can start to work outward from there and say, so why was it necessary to have this in the first place? The Thai police were already setting up DNA testing facilities there in the south to allow the relatives of people who had been killed in the tsunami to help identify who among the dead were their family members. And so there was already this quite extensive DNA testing process available to them. Well, okay, so then as I'm writing about this scene, this sort of parallel DNA testing facility that's not controlled by the Thai police, I can explore why it is that Burmese migrants were afraid of going to anything associated with the Thai police. They wanted to stay as far away from Thai officials as they could. So there had been a large number of bodies recovered after the tsunami, regrettably, and so they could test the DNA of those bodies, but then if they didn't have living counterparts to test against, they couldn't identify who was from the corresponding families. So if they had this parallel facility, then one run by a Burmese NGO in this case, then more Burmese people would be comfortable going to this facility because they didn't have to interact with the police. They weren't exposing themselves to who knows what kind of official problems by being in the presence of Thai officials. And so more of them felt more comfortable is perhaps overstating it, but more willing to go to this facility to get tested. And so from there, I could extend further out to talk about why Burmese migrants were so uncomfortable with Thai officialdom. That has to do with historical tensions between Thai kingdoms and Burmese kingdoms from dating back hundreds of years, and the threat that many of them felt of getting drawn into human trafficking if they were taken in by the police. So describing that one event then, that one site, allows me to write outward from there to capture a much, much broader set of relations. So then this is why they're suggesting that you can anchor your writing in a particular moment, something that is vivid. It gives you the starting point to start to unroll further what all of the rest of the situation might be. Finally, you can organize your writing thematically, picking the things that relate to specific topics of importance to you, your study, that are particularly important to your interviewees. To this end, it might be helpful to keep a log as you're writing up your notes of key terms, key ideas, key topics from the write-up of your fieldwork. That way, as you go from one interview to another, and you see certain terms start to emerge in multiple interviews, or certain ideas or certain topics, then you know, okay, I've got something that I can track here. There's something important going on here. They write, ethnographers rely upon keywords and phrases from their jottings to jog their memories. But writing field notes from jottings is not a straightforward remembering and filling in. Rather, it is a much more active process of constructing relatively coherent sequences of action and evocations of scene and character. In turning jottings and head notes into full notes, the field worker is already engaging in a sort of preliminary analysis. This process involves deciding not simply what to include, but also what to leave out. So then what they're pointing to is that there's an analytical quality. It's preliminary, but it's still an analytical quality already built into the writing up of your field notes, because you're going through a selection process, what to emphasize, what to de-emphasize, what to leave out altogether, what to write about more elaborately. So then I'll add one cautionary note. In this process, it's worth depicting minor events or incidents because, as I've already said, it's not clear in the moment what's going to become important down the road. So try to be as inclusive as possible when you're writing up your notes so that you don't let something slip through the cracks that could have been important down the road. Okay, depictions of scenes. They suggest 3 strategies for coherent, vibrant depictions. Description, dialogue, and characterization. By description, they're writing about a means of picturing through concrete sensory details the basic scenes, settings, objects, people, and actions the field worker observed. So then a description of a scene will come to life when it's detailed, when you're not relying on vague or generic kinds of figures of speech to describe a scene, but when you're giving precise detail, sensory imagery, what they say. And what also will give them life is immediacy through details presented at close range. So the things, not the things then that are these kinds of broad generalities. So imagine if in writing about the DNA testing facility, I had started with the history of Thai-Burmese relations dating back to the 1600s. That's not going to be a very smooth way to get into the specificity of this DNA testing facility. Rather, starting with the concrete details of this particular setting, the social interactions emerging around it, and working outward from that, that's going to give a much livelier kind of description. On the other hand, then, relying on stereotypes or cliches when describing people or places, it deadens the writing and it saps it of useful, specific information. It gives just generic information. That's not what we're after. We're after specific, particular information. For jottings, they might do these sort of stereotypes or figures of speech or cliches. They might do some mnemonic work, but for notes and formal writing, particularity is better. So mnemonic, there's your $10 word of the day. It's also important to describe action as well as people, places, and things. So not just what people say, but how they say it. So you can imagine then that when you're reading a script, say, the words on the page are going to have less less information about the social relations between the people in the scene than a performance of that script will. Why? Because with the performance, you get the embodiment, the people's bodily expression of the attitudes that the characters are taking. How they're speaking to one another can often be as important as what they say to one another. Is somebody speaking ironically or sarcastically? Is somebody saying something as a joke or with complete sincerity? So how they say something, how they interact will be sometimes as important as the words themselves. So this brings us to the next strategy, dialogue. Here we're talking about conversations that occur in the ethnographer's presence or that members report having had with others. So then we have two kinds of dialogue, right? The kind of dialogue involving the ethnographer directly and the kind of dialogue that happened out of the ethnographer's view and hearing, but that are being reported by somebody the ethnographer is talking to. Indirect quotation allows the researcher to track the flow of conversation, while direct quotation can preserve exactly what people said when getting it verbatim is important. So these are two different emphases. It's going to be very hard to do both at once, maybe impossible to do both at once. And they're going to provide you with different things. So, and you get some examples of what each of these looks like in the reading. So I'll leave those to you to go back over and so that you can appreciate what the merits of indirect versus direct quotation may be. But as sort of a quick rule, you could think of indirect quotation as so where you're not putting words in quotation marks, getting them exactly as the person or the people spoke them. You're getting the flow of conversation among different people. Whereas with the direct quotation, you're getting exactly what the interviewees said. Capturing dialogue, though, involves more than just recording speech, because people also gesture. They have facial expressions. Again, how they speak, how they express themselves non-verbally, these will also be very, very important telling things. They adopt particular postures that are also communicative. All of these things happen during conversations. As I've already said, they speak ironically, sarcastically, jokingly, seriously. They get interrupted. They interrupt themselves to go off onto some other tangent. Capturing all of these things is a way of capturing the sort of the entire social environment in which talk is happening. And all of these things can be very revealing and very important. If somebody is speaking to you about something, having to do, say, with a family member's experience of the pandemic, and you can catch that they're speaking in a halting way, that what they're talking about is difficult for them to talk about, that difficulty in a way introduces a certain kind of tempo to their speech. Then getting that down in your notes allows you, when you go back later, to see what they were saying in a particular light, right? You understand now that this is something that was hard for this person to talk about. And so then being able to go through why it was difficult for that person to talk about and what sorts of ethical implications this person was grappling with as they were talking, all of that comes from being attentive to how they presented what they were saying. Not just the words that they were saying, but how they spoke them. So then the point of the strategy of getting down dialogue is that you're able to render writing in the specific social relations of which the dialogue is part. Third then is characterization. They say, while a simple description of a person's dress and movements conveys some minimal sense of that individual, the writer more fully characterizes a human being through also showing how that person talks, acts, and relates to others. An ethnographer most effectively characterizes individuals in context as they go about their daily activities, rather than by simply listing their characteristics. Right? So if you just tick off a bunch of characteristics of somebody, you're getting this kind of almost flat sense of who they are. It's that character, in a sense, emerges in social settings, not in a vacuum, not in isolation. And so this is what they're trying to emphasize here, is this attentiveness to how people's character is most clearly visible in the social context, and how the description, therefore, has to include this person within a social context, not as just kind of an abstract individual made up of a series of sort of boxes that you could tick. The authors point here to the way that characterization is not a matter of isolated individuals, as I was just saying. Traits and characteristics appear in and through interaction with others, rather than by being presented as isolated qualities of individuals. So you could almost, this is not quite what they're saying, but it's almost what they're saying, that what we're interested in here is the social individual, not the sort of the individual psyche, isolated from other from other people, from a social environment. So those who are central to a scene are the ones the ethnographer characterizes most carefully and fully. So in my case, that was very often the lawyers who I was following. So if they were addressing a group of migrants, for my purposes, they would be the central characters. The migrants would be important, but they would not have the same kind of centrality to the scene that I was writing about. So then the ethnographer will also include him or herself as a character in interactions, noting with care how central or marginal she is or he is in the roles he or she plays in the unfolding events. So again, another example of this would be when I was with these lawyers, at one point the Burmese American NGO individual, he asked me if I would address an audience of Mon and Burmese, ethnically Mon and Burmese migrants, to talk about what human rights are, because he knew that I was there doing research on human rights, and so he thought having this guy who's doing his PhD research address them would be, it would do some work for him of some kind. Of course, I spoke neither Mon nor Burmese, so he had to translate for me. So when I write about that scene, I have to keep myself in the frame, right? There's trying to exclude myself from the frame. There, it would have just made a catastrophe of making sense of that scene. It would have been incomprehensible. And so there are other scenes where I was less central. And so trying to push myself into the center of it would have been also very strange. It would have sort of made the ethnography all about me rather than all about the people I was trying to understand. And so acknowledging my presence, but without pushing myself into the center of the frame, was also important to recognize the position that I was in, how marginal or how central I was in in any particular circumstance. So this is something that's going to be, I think, obvious in your case. You're going to be interviewing the people who you wind up writing about. So you're going to be you're going to be present at the scene of everything that you describe. Now, whether there are things that happen in the background that are revealing to you that don't actually directly involve you is going to be another issue. And if there are, and if you describe those scenes, then, of course, your presence might recede further into the background to capture what was going on. And then there will be other characters who are central. They make a final point about using passive voice. Simply avoid it. The problem with passive voice is not that it's grammatically incorrect. It's a perfectly grammatically sound form of expression. The problem is that it hides the subject of a sentence. You don't know who the actor is when you use the passive voice. In sociology and anthropology, of course, who is acting and who is receiving action are vital things to have straight. Who the social actors are, that's what you're writing about, in a sense. And using the passive voice obscures that. So I've got a description here below about what active and passive voice are. I leave that there for you to read for yourselves. I just want to flag this along the way because it's an important thing. There are different disciplines where the use of passive voice can be very powerful. Sociology and anthropology, in my view, are not among them. It weakens your descriptions and it weakens your analysis because it obscures who actors are. Now, organizing your notes. As a way to help recall how fieldwork unfolded, what actually happened when you were in the field, what events and interactions you saw, the authors suggest organizing the writing of your notes around what they call units that you can then link together into an overall narrative. Now, so they think a typical unit would be a paragraph. That is a coherent depiction of a specific moment or idea. One idea, one paragraph. That's it. New idea, new paragraph. Frankly, that's how you should write anyway. A paragraph shouldn't have more than one idea. A paragraph should be an exploration of a particular idea. When you've explored that idea and you're moving on to the next one, that's time for a new paragraph. So the structure is similar here. They want you, as you move from one moment to another, to start a new unit, a new paragraph for that next moment. So if a scene is made up of a number of moments, and these are going to be moments as you have created them in the construction of your writing, so that what is significant for you as a break-off point between one moment and another, that's your creation. You're going to do it for the purposes of coherence and to meet your analytical strategies, and that's fine. But don't just have one long continuous paragraph that has all of these different moments undifferentiated from one another as if like a stream of consciousness, because that's not helpful in breaking up into analytically coherent units for the reader what it is that you're describing. This is why they're emphasizing this idea of units. A sketch would then bring together several paragraphs to describe a scene through detailed imagery. So think of this as being like a snapshot of a character or a setting. It orients the reader to important aspects of the context in which action occurs. So it's not the action itself, but it's the snapshot that captures that or the sketch, if you prefer. They explain a sketch typically is a brief segment which unifies descriptive details about a setting, an individual, or a single incident. Because it is primarily static, it lacks any sense of consequential action, plot, and any full characterizations of people. So, sketch is helpful for setting a scene. An episode, on the other hand, recounts action and moves in time to narrate a slice of life. In an episode, a writer constructs a brief incident as more or less a unified depiction of one continuous action or interaction. So here's where action, movement, enter the analysis or enter the description. So then writing up an episode could be a paragraph or two that describes how a brief interaction or event unfolded. So it's important with episodes to mark the passage of time. A sketch is kind of a freeze frame of a moment in time. An episode captures the passage of time as social action unfolds. Over the course of fieldwork, episodes may connect to other episodes that the researcher can link through what they call transitional summaries. So these will be the bridges that you use to connect one moment of an interview, an episode in an interview, to another episode in a different interview. And you'll create these transitional summaries to act as bridges between them to show how these belong together analytically, why it makes sense to bring them together. Equally, it's possible for episodes to stand on their own, unintegrated with other episodes. So again, as another example from my fieldwork, after the tsunami, of course, there was widespread destruction. There was a huge amount of reconstruction to be done then. And also, not surprisingly, a large number of migrant workers from Burma, not exclusively, but primarily, were involved in this reconstruction. They were the ones actually rebuilding schools and other buildings. And one individual, a construction worker, had fallen at, I think it was a school they were rebuilding, at the construction site anyway, and had landed on his head, and he was in a coma. And so it was unclear how he was going to get ongoing medical care while he was in a coma. He didn't have other family there, but there were friends of his from the work site that through the NGO got in touch with the lawyers, and so we all went to see this individual at his bedside. Of course, we weren't talking to him. He was in a coma. And with his friends, then the lawyers wanted to work out how they were going to make sure that this guy continued to get care. And so they had this kind of bedside strategy session to make these decisions. So this is an episode, right? I've just described an episode. This happened, then this happened, then this happened. Here's what it looked like at the bedside, and so forth. And here's what they talked about. Here's what they did. If I were doing a good job of it, I would give you the exact details of the conversation, but we don't have time for that. Now, as it turned out, that episode wound up, although being interesting for me, wound up being a kind of standalone episode. I didn't work out how I would connect it with the other major themes in my ethnography. So I couldn't develop a transitional summary that would integrate it into the analysis that I was doing through the rest of the ethnography. And so as a result, this episode didn't make it into my book. Not because it was unimportant, but because it was this kind of standalone episode, and I just couldn't work out how it is that I would bring it into the analysis without it being more interruptive than illustrative of something. So that then is what a standalone episode could look like. Okay, asides and commentaries. The act of writing up notes at the end of the day, so you've taken your jottings, you've taken what you remember from your fieldwork, now you're writing up your notes. It's also a process for the researcher of assimilating and making sense of new information gathered during fieldwork. Some of that will be making sense in the light of research that you've already done when you're on your second and third interviews. Some of it will just be making sense in terms of what you already understand to be the case about the pandemic and how people are responding to it. So selecting and organizing details, placing emphasis on certain details and not on others, these are parts of that process. So asides and commentaries are ways of engaging in that process. They could be notes or questions in the margin of the page. You can see that on this example here. These are not my notes. These are someone else's notes. But you can see how, as the ethnographer has written up notes, he or she has also jotted little things in the margin, has intervened in the notes to flag things that are that need further commentary or further investigation, maybe posing questions for yourself to answer down the road, but also maybe giving yourself longer periods of reflection, so that you've just written up a section of notes and then maybe there's something that you want to consider at further length, so you just type that in. Maybe you section it off with brackets, or you put it in a different colored font or something to mark it as a reflection. So, but you break it off from the rest of the notes that you've just taken so that it's clear that this is your commentary, or this is the set of questions that you want to ask. Now, asides are slightly longer reflections than the researcher can use. Oh, sorry, asides are what I was just talking about. The questions in the margin, the little quick notes. So that you might just put down like a little point form note of some hunch you have about what's going on, so that you can come back to it later. So the commentaries then would be the more extended reflections that you might break off with a different colored font or square brackets or something like that. Some way of marking them as your commentary on what you've just noted from your field work, from your jottings. So, for example, did an interviewee use a phrase or a figure of speech that you heard in another interview, but that didn't strike you as important at that time, and does strike you as important in the light of this use of it, or this instance of speech that's similar but not identical, say. So the commentary gives you that chance to kind of think out loud about what the importance might be. Okay, writing and reading modes. They say, to characterize field notes as descriptions initially conveys the prospect of simple, straightforward writing. But once we recognize that description involves more than a one-to-one correspondence between written accounts and what's going on, writing field notes raises complex, perplexing problems. So then, rather being these comprehensive descriptions, which you can't give a written description that is completely comprehensive of a social setting, right? So they're your reconstruction, as we said right at the beginning. So rather than giving comprehensive descriptions, field notes are narratives that vividly depict slices of life. To handle the complexities of producing field note description, the researcher first works in a writing mode, taking down notes, taking down jottings, turning them into notes, which you embellish with your memories, and then at the end, you have a text. You've produced a text. Here, the point is to capture accurately as possible what happened. Following the production of the text, though, there's a reading mode, which is the researcher's opportunity to read over field notes and start the reflective work of thinking about how he or she constructed the notes, created a record of a scene, and what they what they explain, what they teach, what they reveal, and so forth. Now, for your purposes, not everything here that we've just gone through is going to apply. You're doing interviews, you're not doing immersive field work, you're working in a familiar setting. Probably for virtually all of you, it will be a familiar setting, not in a setting to which you're foreign. So don't think of these chapters as producing some kind of checklist where you need to check off every box to do a complete job. That's not what they're doing. It's friendly advice. It's a series of thoughts on how you can approach your research. Not all of it is going to be relevant to all of you. Some parts will be relevant to some, other parts will be relevant to others. One of the tricks about fieldwork is it is something that each of you does individually. And so the particular circumstances that you as an individual researcher find yourself in and write about, these are going to be particular to you in a way that generalities are not going to capture exhaustively. And so you need to sort of pick and choose and experiment a bit to figure out what kinds of strategies, what techniques, what writing models and methods are going to work for you. So this has then just been to try and get you to start thinking about how you'll approach your interviews and to give you some kind of orienting ideas on how you can undertake that work most effectively to get the most out of the interviews and therefore write the most dazzling papers that you can. That's it. Okay, thank you.